Hi, I'm Adam Feinberg, and today we are talking Washington Heights, and welcome to another episode of Harlem Stories. And today I'm here with my co-host, Mark Becker.
How's everyone doing? Ready to learn about Uptown?
Awesome. So today, Washington Heights, there's so much information in this. We actually decided to break this up into two different episodes. Today is going to be part one. So it's one of the larger, Washington Heights is one of the larger neighborhoods in Manhattan, and because it's so it's so large, this episode is really more intended to be more of an overview. We'll touch on like some of the more interesting aspects of the neighborhood, and I guess other episodes will do more of a deeper dive into some of the specific histories of the neighborhood and stories of Washington Heights. So a couple of examples of other episodes we've recorded, such as the Audubon Historic District or the Morris Jamel Mansion, are a couple of examples of where we do specific deeper dives. To describe the neighborhood and understand where we're talking about geographically, we're talking about the northern, one of the most northernmost portions of Manhattan. Only Inwood is the only geographically attached portion of Manhattan as we go forward. But the neighborhood runs from 155th Street to Dyckman Street, which Dyckman roughly equates to, I believe, about 200th Street. So it's about 45 blocks north to south.
If you look at Manhattan like it's a bottle, right? This is kind of the bottleneck if it were to shift a little bit west.
Yeah. And then the island starts getting narrower and narrower,
right.
As you start, going. So I think, that bottle, description.
The addresses are exclusively west, if I'm not correct.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're talking all exclusively west, and some of the address numbers go into let's say like 800 something, west 181st Street, which you don't have many addresses in the 800
You
numbers.
don't see that in Chelsea, for example.
Right. In Chelsea, I think it might go into the 600s, the address as far as west.
I feel like Chelsea... I feel like the 500 block is between 11th and 12th.
Yeah, and I think there's a little sliver that might go to 6. I could be mistaken though. Chelsea,
Sure.
Chelsea's not my expertise, but I know definitely into the 500s. You're right. Whether it goes into the 600s, we're not sure. So that gives you an address for each avenue. For anybody that's not familiar with the Manhattan grid, typically it's based off of most frequently off of Fifth Avenue. Which is the east-west dividing line. If you go within Fifth Avenue, 1 block east or 1 block west, it's 0 to 100, obviously depending on which side of Fifth Avenue you're on, east or west.
Right.
And then it goes, but typically, and this doesn't always hold true 100% of the time, but then it typically, for the next avenue over, it goes, divided up by the next 100 addresses. So, 0 to 100 if you're a block, the next avenue over will be 100 to 200.
There are, I know this is a different topic and maybe we could cover it in another episode, but there are a few addresses, like for instance, if you're on between 2nd and 3rd on the east side, it's all 200, but occasionally you'll see like a 199 or something like that. Anyway.
Yeah, there's like, and they're typically, when you see something like 199 or 201, those are typically more corner lots. Anomaly
addresses.
Yeah, so and sometimes those addresses actually have 2 addresses because because they are corner lots. That's more often the reason you'll see that. I don't know if that's true 100% of the time, but I know at least most of the time when I've seen that, they tend to be that. All right, so given that we talked about the north south. On the west side is the west and east sides actually in these neighborhoods are actually really easy too. So the neighborhood borders are very easy to find. On the west side, it's going to be the Hudson River, and on the east side, it's going to be the East River. So the borders of Washington Heights aren't really much in dispute. Anywhere where uncommon in Manhattan. However, if you get into Hudson Heights, a lot of people, or some of these other sub neighborhoods, people might dispute some of the borders on these sub neighborhoods.
Got it.
So in terms of Washington Heights is named for Fort Washington. It's a fort that was constructed at the highest natural point in Manhattan for the Continental Army troops to defend against the British. Always goes back to that, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like there's so much of Manhattan history and so much of Manhattan that is so influenced by, our fight against the British and our independence.
Absolutely.
So I think that's always so cool, to go back and everything seems to always tie back to that. In terms of Washington Heights, it's the topography, as the name suggests. It's not just some of the highest elevations in all of Manhattan, but also has blocks with some of the steepest hills.
That's right.
In fact, if you're at 181st Street, and you're going west, not only are you dealing with some steep hills, from that point, which is why that portion of the neighborhood has also been named Hudson Heights. But at the same time, if you want to go north and you're traveling on 181st Street, there are parts over there like near Cabrini or Fort Washington, where you have to go up multiple sets of staircases in those, or Bennett, and you have to go up multiple sets of staircases in order to cross town. So the elevations there are intense. And while it didn't apply to this neighborhood, just to kind of give you a visual, anybody that's seen the movie, the Joker, where the character does that dance along those multiple stairways, which were actually filmed in the Bronx, on the west side of the Bronx. It's kind of similar to that in Washington Heights, where in order to get to like a particular block, you might have to go through, it's like 5 continuous or 6 continuous sets of stairs. So pretty steep.
There's the one that comes to mind, I believe it's on 181st Street. There's a lot of great restaurants in that area, 181st. I want to say real close to that entrance to the West Side Highway, there's a real steep set of stairs that I think takes you up to Fort Washington Avenue from 181 and around Cabrini.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's like one of the ones that I had in mind as well. That's probably that same staircase. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and connect the dots. For now, I do want to get into describe, from a higher level standpoint, the sub neighborhoods and the historic districts. So, we've discussed that at length, and we've had additional episodes of like the Audubon Historic District and the Morris Jamel Mansion and Sylvan Terrace. All those we've had, 2 different episodes covering that. From 100 Audubon Terrace, being the 155th Street to roughly 158th Street. The Morris Jamel Mansion and Sylvan Terrace, roughly from around 160th to around 162nd. So giving you a little bit of a sense, and even though we just covered in a whole episode for those that had not listened to that episode yet, talking about the Morris Jamel Mansion, it was originally built by British officer Roger Morris and his wife Mary. Ultimately, they wound up vacating the house as a result of the Continental Army and the rebellion. So they wound up vacating. Roger Morris wound up going back to Britain. His wife Mary, she went going up to her family estate in what's now Westchester. and just making sure that the family stayed safe. While it was vacant, the house was commandeered as a temporary headquarters by George Washington, and yes, he actually did sleep there.
Wow.
So ultimately, it was his temporary headquarters for the Continental Army. The house sat unused for many years while local farmers used to farm the land, and later on, the house was wound up purchased by another family or a husband and wife, and planning their family, Stephen and Eliza Jamel. And years had passed, and Stephen had died. Eliza remarried just a year after her husband had died, and she got married to yet another famous person, Aaron Burr. And her marriage to Aaron Burr, well, he was apparently a spendthrift, and she had worked really hard to accumulate the wealth she had and lost patience really quickly with him. And she filed for divorce just 4 months later. We talk all about all the details on this, but might as well go into the scandalous part of it. Is to handle Eliza Jamel's divorce, she wound up hiring none other than Alexander Hamilton's son, Alexander Hamilton Jr., to handle the divorce from Aaron Burr.
Wow.
So you get into this all scandalous aspects over it, because Aaron Burr, shot Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel. So how's that for revenge? Not just filing for divorce, but hiring your enemy's son to be the divorce attorney.
That would have made a great episode of Jerry Springer.
Yeah, it would. And in fact, we that whole episode, that we discuss, it almost sounds like an episode of Jerry Springer, Founding Father edition. So, some real crazy stuff. Sylvan Terrace, it was the original carriage drive of the Morris Jamel Mansion and connected with Kingsbridge Road, which is now currently known as St. Nicholas Avenue. And it's just a one-block street off the traditional Manhattan street grid, paved with cobblestone, leading straight on to the Morris Jamel Mansion. And both sides of the street contain a total of 20 wood-framed townhouses that were built in 1882. They had wooden clapboard facades. And over the years, they had degraded, and then there was grants provided to restore them. They've since been restored, giving the block a unique, uniform yet quaint feel to them. They were actually built to be middle-class housing for middle-class residents rather than for servants of the mansion, which is what a lot of people commonly believed. And if you want to learn more about that, we discuss more about the Morris Jamel Mansion and Sylvan Terrace as its own standalone episode of Harlem Stories. So going back into some of the sub-neighborhoods, we also have Hudson Heights, and that area is considered generally west of Broadway, north of the George Washington Bridge, which the George Washington Bridge is its own little aspect of the story of Washington Heights. But it's either considered either 179th or 181st Street, considering that border for the neighborhood or this little sub-neighborhood of Hudson Heights. And the dividing line between that is going further north, and that is what connects some of the parks. The dividing line between Fort George and Hudson Heights is Broadway. So very often you'll see most of the condos and co-ops in this northern section of Washington Heights. Most of them are going to be on the west side of Broadway. So, the east side, there is that big dividing line with, Fort George. There aren't as many condos and co-ops there. And we'll talk a little bit more about the neighborhood, as well. But the name was created by the Hudson Heights Owners Coalition in the 1990s to promote co-op sales. With there's mostly these Art Deco buildings, and it adds a certain residential character along with the proximity to both the Hudson and Fort Tryon Park. I guess there's been a lot of controversy with the name Hudson Heights because there's a lot of Washington Heights residents that don't approve of this sub-neighborhood and they consider it snooty. But us as real estate agents, we make that distinction because, if you're looking mostly east of Broadway, it's largely more on the rental side of the world. So, if you're going to be looking that far north, there's some great developments, and we'll talk more
Certainly
about that.
A much different flavor to the area east or west of Broadway, I would say, between 181 and the northern tip of Manhattan.
Yeah, exactly. And I think an easy way to describe it, and because we're real estate agents, we don't really like discussing a lot of things. Even though this is a podcast, we never really want to kind of tip the scales in terms of like fair housing. But I think an easy way to describe it was the movie In the Heights, and I think that was a little bit more descriptive of what to expect on the east of Broadway, the Fort Washington neighborhood.
Sure.
So that or Fort George neighborhood. Fort George, it was named after another Revolutionary War fort, and this, it's not as well known primarily because it just doesn't get the kind of press as Hudson Heights. So ultimately, it's with that sub neighborhood designation, it's more of the southern portion of the neighborhood, and the 191st Street subway station, is one of those things that help characterize the neighborhood, and it's so deep underground that researchers at NYU determined that it would be a safe location from a nuclear explosion.
Wow.
So, it's kind of crazy. But Fort George is one of the neighborhood that has the rare semi-private streets. Washington Terrace, which is only about a half block long from 100 West 186th Street, and it's just like little clapboard wooden houses that dominate that half block section. And I would describe like these neighborhoods over here, and that neither Hudson Heights or Fort George have a large concentration of condos. Hudson Heights has a lot of co-ops. Fort George has some, but it's just not the same concentration. Moving right along to the next aspect of getting to know Washington Heights is higher education. And I know we mentioned Berwickwood College in a couple different episodes. Private college, and it was designed to serve the educational needs of Puerto Ricans, specifically, and other Hispanics. It's got a student population of about 1,200 students, so not a particularly large school, it's very specialized. But they actually do have a total of 4 campuses. There's in Washington Heights, and I didn't actually even know this, North Williamsburg, East Williamsburg, and I did know about the one in the Bronx. But nearly 80% of the student body is over 25 years old with family responsibilities. So, Berwickwood College isn't like what you'd normally expect out of most colleges. So obviously it's geared toward more adult learning at that point. Mm-hmm. In terms of other educational facilities, you have a world famous, the Columbia Medical Campus, collectively known as the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. And actually it contains a total of 5 different schools. You've got the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeries, and the second is the College of Dental Medicine. The third one is the Mailman School of Public Health. The fourth school is the School of Nursing, and they actually just got a brand new building, and it's kind of I don't know quite how to describe it. I kind of think of it as like the wacky building. It's kind of an interesting architectural modern design.
You talking about around 125th Street or what's now Martin Luther King?
No. This is actually within like the 180s area.
Oh, north of the hospital then.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I know that like what you might be talking about is maybe like Toro College, I believe, or
over
the podiatry.
by the old fairway on the Hudson over there.
Yeah, I don't know of. Well, obviously you got Columbia now there, but
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't know of any other over there. But and finally the fifth school of associated with Columbia there is the biomedical programs of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So already we have a rather significant university presence, and then add to it, and unfortunately they got hit by the scam artist of Bernie Madoff, but Yeshiva University, they had invested with him, and it's located in the Fort George sub-neighborhood. And this is also partially why that there's not these residents, so much residential, because it's also a combination of their campus.
There's actually for those of us who eat kosher food, there's a great place called Golan Heights right by the Yeshiva campus. Great Middle Eastern food, kosher. And what's interesting about it is if you look at where the Golan Heights is located in Israel, it's kind of geographically similar, sort of that northeast portion, as to where the Golan Heights Cafe is located in Manhattan. Anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of a cool factoid over here. And actually, Yeshiva University has a total of 3 different colleges. Yeshiva College, there's the Sim School of Business, and then there's the, I believe that it's a women's only program, Marcia Stern Talmudic Academy High School. And I know that having graduated from NYU Stern, I've had a few people ask me, I'm like, oh, is that part of Yeshiva? I'm like, no, that's actually NYU, different Stern, different family.
I think the women's school of Yeshiva is Stern.
Yeah, that's exactly, I thought the same, so I'm sure you're probably correct on that. As with so many of our episodes, because there is so much greenery in Upper Manhattan, I always like to talk about some of the larger parks that are present, in these neighborhoods. You've got the Riverside Park, the northernmost portion, the Riverside Oval, that only extends about a couple blocks into Washington Heights, where Riverside Park ends at the Riverside Oval at around 157th Street. So that gives you that aspect, and a lot of the people that live around the Riverside Oval, they volunteer, to help with a lot of the greenery over there and keep it well weeded and and pretty. There is Fort Washington Park, and as is a common theme in it, this park is actually named after Fort Washington from the Revolutionary War. And remnants of the original fort can be found at the site of Bennett Park, which also holds the distinction of being the highest natural point in Manhattan. The park itself is located along the Hudson from 155th to Dyckman Street to the north. And it's pretty much a narrow sliver of land and it widens a little bit as you approach the GW Bridge and the Hudson River Greenway that was built for pedestrians and cyclists. As you head a little further north, Fort Washington remains along the Hudson River to Route 9A, the Henry Hudson. But from 190th Street alongside the opposite side of 9A is Fort Tryon Park. And, obviously, since we're talking about the George Washington Bridge, there's also that children's book, The Little Red Lighthouse, and it's based off of the last remaining lighthouse in Manhattan. And the book is actually technically named The Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge. Huh. So, very famous children's book. And since the GW Bridge with its brilliant lights and 600-foot towers overwhelmed the lighthouse, it was decommissioned, abandoned, and then it was actually slated for demolition. And when the demolition was announced, thousands of children who loved the book started a campaign nationwide to save the Little Red Lighthouse. In part to their efforts, the ownership of the lighthouse was ultimately transferred from the Port Authority to the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. And today, visitors can climb the long iron stair to the top of the tower, where the lantern room is again fitted with working lids that blinks at barges and passenger ships sailing under the bridge. So I thought that's a cool aspect. But the Parks Department relinquished a parcel of land along 179th Street for construction of the GW Bridge in its early early days. And just a little factoid of the bridge, it's one of the longest suspension bridges in the world.
Wow.
There was also in that same vicinity what's known as Inspiration Point. It's a popular rest stop for cyclists with amazing views of the Hudson, the Palisades, and the GW Bridge. And finally, over here, there's a boat marina that opened on the north end of the park at Dyckman in 1995, and the marina actually has a fishing pier and a restaurant. And from what I understand, that pier restaurant can get quite lively on the summer weekends.
That's a very interesting part of town. I've been up there a number of times where you have that kind of, I almost feel like you're in Louisiana or something.
Yeah, it does kind of have that kind of
swampy feel.
Yeah, exactly. Moving on to the next park, High Bridge. So High Bridge was actually seen. There was a scene in the movie In the Heights. There's a large swimming pool scene. I think it was a song and sort of dance number, and you can that was actually filmed in the pool area of High Bridge. There's also a water tower adjacent to the pool, which we'll talk about in multiple episodes due to the nature of that, the importance of that tower. It was actually a key piece of New York City's fresh water supply from upstate. So we'll talk more about that in future episodes. And then in terms of one of the last of the I think there's a couple more parks. Fort Tryon Park, it was purchased in 1917 by John D. Rockefeller Jr. And a few months later, he wound up announcing that Fort Tryon Park would be given to the city under the condition that it joins the existing Fort Washington and Riverside parks, and that the city would wind up maintaining it. And in 1921, ultimately, the city acquired 30 acres of land to connect the two park sites, fulfilling their promise to Rockefeller. The south end of that park, it starts from 190th and goes up to Dyckman to the north. And Fort Tryon Park runs adjacent to Fort George Park, separated by the highway. So we're getting into all these little nitty-gritty details, but there's a whole bunch of parks up here. So right. Even though they're almost like piecemeal and kind of like separated by formality, but this was. Sorry, so these were kind of separated almost by formality. This was also known as the Tryon Hall estate, owned by C.K.G. Billings and a few other wealthy landowners in that area. But what's interesting about it is the archway to the entrance of that estate. It still exists in the park, and it could be a whole fun exploration thing to try and hunt down the archway entrance within the park. Rockefeller bought the land with the expectation that it was also going to be part of the park. But what really becomes interesting again is who helped turn it into a formal park for the Department of New York City, and it was the Olmsted brothers. And this is the same Olmsted that designed Central Park, Riverside Park, and so many others that really played a central role in New York City. Rockefeller also bought sculptor George Gray Bernard's collection of medieval art, and he wound up gifting it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and built the cloisters within the park to house the collection. So you have this awesome museum, almost like what you have on the Met, down on, what is it, around 79th, 80th?
84th and 5th.
84th and 5th. Obviously, East Side has always been my weak point. But the museum that they built it's called the Cloisters, and the museum was built on a steep hill with upper and lower levels, with medieval gardens and a series of chapels and themed galleries. And if you're not familiar with the Cloisters, it's like that that interior courtyard type of feel. And, if you think of like Harry Potter, it gives you like that sense of that feel. The design and the layout of the museum is intended to evoke a sense of medieval European monastic life. And ultimately, at this point, the museum now probably holds roughly around 5,000 works of art and architecture, all European, mainly from the 12th to 15th centuries. And, the information about the cloisters, it's so voluminous, that we could probably devote an entire episode to it. So, stay tuned. We'll make an episode just on the cloisters. Finally, the last park I want to discuss is going to be Bennett Park. And it's named for James Gordon Bennett Sr. He was a newspaper publisher who launched the New York Herald in 1835 on land he purchased in 1871. And most people know Bennett Park for one reason. It's the highest natural point in Manhattan, a total of 265 feet above sea level. Huh. So, while lower Manhattan is very close to sea level and parts of Manhattan are very close, this is obviously nowhere near that point. It's the site of the old Fort Washington, and the park hosts events including, on occasion, Revolutionary War reenactment, which you have the Redcoats and George Washington's army converge and fight in the park and reenacting the Battle of Fort Washington. And then I guess a final thing worth mentioning is, just across the street from Bennett Park, you've got the 181st Street A train. So, that kind of gets us into,
Express to Midtown.
Express to Midtown, exactly. So that's one of the great things, about the neighborhood. So there's so much information on this, that we are just kind of, on this neighborhood, we are forced to break this up into 2 episodes. And, stay tuned for part 2 of Getting to Know Washington Heights. I'm Adam Feinberg, and I'm here with Mark Becker as my co-host. Thank you so much for listening to Harlem Stories.
Thanks for joining us.
Have a great one.